Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Tonight's treat guest is Dr. David Falk, a rising star in Egyptology. Or not Egyptology, but introducing the Exodus to the public mind.
Great.
All right. How are you, my good sir?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Okay, so tell the dear audience all about yourself, and we can go from there.
Well, I mean, I think you've already given away the punchline. I'm an Egyptologist.
And Bible scholar extraordinaire.
Yes, and a Bible scholar as well. I have 4 graduate degrees to my name. I did a pair of master's degrees at Trinity International University, and then I did a 3rd master's degree in Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations at the University of Toronto. And then I did a PhD at the University of Liverpool. And that PhD was in Egyptology.
All right. So I guess the best place to start is the history of Egypt itself.
Okay.
For the purposes of historical context for the audience, summarize the history of it from 3000 BC up until the time when the Exodus took place.
Okay.
Basically...
Go on.
Go ahead.
You're doing fine without me. I don't need to be here.
It's all yours.
The history of Egypt essentially breaks down into basically a sequence of three kingdoms that are separated by various periods. The earliest, and within those periods and kingdoms, is further broken down into dynasties. And a dynasty is a succession of related kings, roughly speaking. Okay? Mm-hmm. So for the first 2 dynasties, what we have is called the pre-dynastic period. And that's where you have dynasties 1 and 2. Then you have the Old Kingdom. This is the pyramid building age, followed by a period of civil war called the First Intermediate Period, followed by a Second Kingdom age that's called the Middle Kingdom. And this is the height of Egyptian culture, the height of Egyptian language, of Middle Egyptian, the height of culture and literature in Egypt. Then you have a Second Intermediate Period, which was dominated by the rule of a Semitic people called the Hyksos. Technically, the Hyksos refers to the leaders of those Semitic people. Right. Followed then by what's sometimes called the Golden Age of Egypt, or the New Kingdom. And this is basically the height of Egypt's imperial period. And then after that, you've got a Third Intermediate Period, and then a late period, Persian period, Ptolemaic periods, and then finally the Romans. And that's Egypt encapsulated in a nutshell.
Okay. So
that is actually very interesting. It is nice to have you on because, for myself, I am working on a project on my own channel about going over the history of women, from ancient times, and I go into I'm reading up on Egypt and how that went with women as well.
Yes.
So it's great. It's great to have you on as well to go over this stuff. My friend has been really the first time I heard of you was I believe it was a video response you sort of did to Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy.
That's the first time a lot of people heard of me. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Better late than never.
Well, yes. I mean, until that point, the YouTube channel was really very small. It was a tight sort of knit community. We had basically a very dedicated and loyal subscriber base who kind of, this was the best kept secret of YouTube. But that fan base too also asked for the review of the Michael Jones video months before it even came out. I mean, I was getting 2 or 3 requests every other month for, hey, we've heard that this video has been hyped. want to know what your opinion is on it. So and really what kind of, I mean, I don't normally do review videos. For me, that's kind of not my style. I tend to do more of those sorts of things when I'm asked to do it, when there's, say, confusion in the community, and then they want me to clarify that confusion.
That's fair. My friend here is a very good fan of the Exodus. He likes reading about it. It is
Anyway, I like
well.
delving into it to see what really happened. My co-host here does not think it happened. I pretty sure that something did happen. Like, I see it, the historicity of the Exodus as comparable to that of the Trojan War, but perhaps you can bring more clarity. Okay, so we have the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period, Middle Kingdom, second intermediate period, then the New Kingdom, which is where most of the fun stuff about Egypt takes place.
Oh, I always found it to be the funnest. That's where I specialized, was in the New Kingdom.
All right.
That's where all the interesting kings are.
Mm-hmm. Well, except for there's also the pyramid ones, but
I don't like pyramids. I think pyramids are really boring.
why?
They're just big piles of stone. There's no interesting reliefs. There's no interesting artwork in them. They're just more or less big piles of stone. When you get to the Sixth Dynasty pyramids, okay, you actually have writing inside some of the pyramids, but to actually go inside and look at them, they're not that interesting.
Yeah, I know, but it's just like the architectural ingenuity at the time.
Well, the one pyramid I really find interesting is the pyramid of Zoser, and that's basically the first pyramid. Mm-hmm. That one's really interesting, but that's more interesting not because so much the pyramid itself, but because of all the extra features around it. It's got a bunch of temples around it. It's got courtyards and these amazing architectural features, such as these cobra friezes. It's got a labyrinth at the bottom of that pyramid. I mean, it's interesting for reasons that you don't normally find in pyramids. So it's sort of an exception. It's an outlier. And even the Egyptians kind of viewed that as the classic pyramid to emulate.
Let's see. Okay, so
it is actually very interesting.
And I'm sure anybody with any rational thinking mind knows that the Israelites did not build the pyramids or slaves of any kind.
Yes. Slaves did not build the pyramids, and the Israelites did not build the pyramids.
Right. This was a job you wanted. The labor was hard, but you got more food. You were taken care of.
Food, medicine, wine,
women,
beef. I mean, look, beef was a big deal in Egypt.
Yeah.
Because it was sort of a staple that you only got if you were nobility. They herded a lot of cows, but the cows were pretty much owned by the nobility.
Okay, and then after this is the Old Kingdom. Then after the Middle Kingdom came the second intermediate period, which is the context for the Exodus, which is in the New Kingdom, regardless of early or late date.
Regardless of early date, the Exodus occurred in the New Kingdom.
Right. Tell the audience about the Hyksos. These foreign rulers basically were to Egypt what the Mongol Khans were to China. Nomads who became enamored with Egyptian culture and wanted to be like them. Like, who were they, and how exactly did they come to power?
Okay, who they were essentially at the end of the Old Kingdom. We have to realize that the environment of both Egypt and the Sinai had changed dramatically from the earliest periods in Egypt up until the New Kingdom. It was actually, that whole area used to be grassland going into the desert. And animals would usually migrate across what's today the Sahara Desert, feeding off the grasslands. What happened at the end of the Old Kingdom was you had an environmental condition that came to an end called the Neolithic Wet Period, where the Sahara started to dry out. With the drying out of the Sahara, the tribal peoples in Sinai and Libya were running out of food. So they migrated into the Nile Delta. During the first intermediate period is when they started actually moving into the Delta. And they settled in the Delta. And they formed this city during Dynasty 11 at a place that we now know as Avaris.
Mm-hmm.
And that became sort of the major city of the area. And it was primarily a Semitic city. And basically, while the Egyptians were still in control, it was just a Semitic city. It was basically sort of feeding off of what Egypt had traditionally considered to be its food larder. The Egyptians didn't like to hunt or fish or do those sorts of things unless it was a time of sort of desperation. So they sort of held the delta in as their food reserves in case of famine. So come Dynasty 11 and all these Semites from the Sinai start pouring in and occupying the delta. They're taking the fish, they're using the water, they're herding their goats and sheep there. And it starts creating some concern. So this is at the time when we have, say, the Egyptian 12th dynasty start talking about the restoration of order in Egypt as the Semite is repressed. Now, during end of Dynasty 11 and Dynasty 12, Egypt has a very, very strong middle kingdom. The Egyptian kingdom is a dominating presence, and they have their capital near the Fayum in a city called Lahun. And what happens is, at the end of Dynasty 13, the Egyptians lose control. They completely, for some reason, they lose control of the entire ball of wax. They don't only lose control of, say, the Delta, they also lose control of the southern regions as well. We don't know why they lost control, but they did. And the Egyptian monarchy has to retreat from Lahun, go back to their homeland in Thebes. And the Hyksos wake up one morning and go, nobody's in charge. Why can't we be in charge? And that's how you get the Hyksos dynasty of Dynasty 15, is they just sort of wake up one morning and just take over.
Were they the Amorites or Amalekites?
They were Amorites. Yeah, that whole sort of area was colonized by sojourning Amorites. But there's other, that's the primary group. But there were other Semitic groups also.
Right. Okay, and you mentioned that the second intermediate period was Joseph's time in your documentary within a documentary. It makes perfect sense.
Documentary within a documentary.
You munching on popcorn and responding to IP.
Hey, I was hungry.
I was free roaming with Assassin's Creed while listening to it, but anyway, it makes perfect sense as to why later pharaohs didn't know about him, but many people like to think it was the Middle Kingdom when he lived around 1700 BC or so.
Yeah.
Since the story would seem all the more moving if he struggled and later found favor with a foreign ruler and was second to the pharaoh himself, as well as him being in a high position that would encourage Semitic people to immigrate and eventually assimilate into Egyptian culture. Explain why this time frame doesn't work.
Okay. Well, it takes a naive, first of all, there's several reasons why it won't work. So it isn't just one reason, it's many reasons. The first reason is because the time frame they're using is they're calculating the 430 years. Mentioned in, I think it's Exodus 12, that they stayed in Egypt. And they're taking a reading specifically from the Masoretic text. Now, if you look at other texts like the Septuagint or the Septuagint Pentateuch, it says that the Israelites spent 430 years in Canaan and Egypt. And if you look at the genealogy of Exodus 6, it's very, very clear that the Israelites could not have been in Egypt longer than 350 years. And even the Apostle Paul, when he talks about the 430 years, He defines that length of time from the time Abraham is given the promise until the Exodus. So all that time does not include their time in Egypt. It's a combined period of time. Now that's one problem. Just the reading of the text is a problem. The second problem is that the introduction of the chariot doesn't take place until the beginning of Dynasty 15. It's introduced through the Hyksos, who imported from Asia. But in the Middle Kingdom, this is long before the introduction of the chariot, and yet we see Joseph riding a chariot not once but twice in the biblical text. So that's a second archaeological problem. The third problem is the allocation of the lands of Goshen. When Joseph's brothers come back and get food, and they have Jacob has his audience before the king. Everyone agrees, early late daters, that Joseph's kin were located in the land of Goshen, which is the farmlands that are surrounding what's the city of Avaris and Per-Ramses. Everyone agrees with that. But people also know that the vizier of Egypt, who is Joseph, would have been located either in the capital city or at the site of the necropolis where the king would be buried. For the Middle Kingdom, that would have been at Dashur or nearby at one of those necropolises near Dashur or Saqqara. And the capital was at Lahun. Both these things are far away from Avaris. And yet in Genesis 45:10, Joseph says to his kin, I am going to give you the best of the land, so you will be near to me. This implies that Joseph was located near Goshen. So there's a lot of strikes against Joseph being located in time in the Middle Kingdom.
Okay. Before we go into...
A thing that I always do find interesting is I believe Joseph's age when he died reflected the Egyptian notion of what's the ideal age to die in.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I believe it's
110 years. That 110 years was considered to be the ideal age for a wise person in Egypt. Mm-hmm. So if you were a wise or somehow spiritually endowed person, you were often attributed an age of 110 years.
It's one of those illustrations that fundamentalists just miss out on.
Yeah, well, it comes down to hermeneutics. It really comes down to hermeneutics, the way you approach the biblical text. Western Christianity for the last 300-400 years has relied on a method called the historical grammatical method, which is you take the grammar and the genre of whatever text you're reading and you apply it, you look at the historical context to come up with the right reading. Okay. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people in, say, American fundamentalism take that historical and sort of change the meaning of it to not the historical context of, say, the archaeology or the time it took place, but saying that whatever naive reading they have is necessarily historical. So it's sort of shifting the meaning of historical grammatical in ways it was never meant to be.
Yeah. Before we go into...
I remember it was sort of like with David Bentley Hart when he's a theologian, I believe, and he said back, when someone says they read the Bible literally, what it meant, at least to the ancient church fathers, it meant ad literam, that you actually took the context and the genre in consideration and you read from that.
Yeah.
That was what it meant to take it literally.
Now what
So
it means is to taken wooden literally. But here's the
yeah,
problem with literal. In fact, I don't even like to use even though I do consider myself somebody who takes the text at as it purports itself to be. I don't like the term literal, and the problem is there's a lot of ways you can take a literal reading and still have it come out literal. Because the problem is some language can have more than one way of taking it as a literal sort of reading. And this is where the confusion comes in. So you ultimately do have to rely back on context, historical context, grammatical context, genre context, to come up with whatever the right meaning of the text is.
good point.
Before we go into the topic of the Exodus itself, let's discuss the identities of the pharaohs up to then. Occam's razor pretty much tells us that Ahmose the first was the pharaoh who did not know Joseph, the native Egyptian pharaoh from Thebes who decimated the Hyksos and drew them out forever and reunited the fractured country. Given the fragmentary traces of the Hyksos, I don't think we'll ever know who the pharaoh who elevated Joseph was, but do you have any good idea who the pharaoh that Abraham came across during the Middle Kingdom, if that story happened?
Well, Abraham dates to roughly the time of Neferhotep the First, but the problem is that there were many, many kings during that period, and almost all those kings are very short-lived. This is one of the sort of the earmarks of, say, Dynasty 13, is that you have 40 plus kings during Dynasty 13. Very few reigned even 10 years. Again, we don't know why this happened. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for a king in Dynasty 13 to reign 2-3 years. Just wasn't uncommon. There's just a high turnover of kings in Dynasty 13. So we'll never really know which king it was that engaged with Abraham.
All right, and before we get to the Pharaoh of the Exodus, let's talk about Moses.
Yep.
I find the idea that he wasn't a historical person completely asinine, to be honest. I see no reason whatsoever as to why the Israelites would make up a legend about this flawed individual who, when you really get immersed in his story, reads like an insecure, reluctant hero who later becomes a Machiavellian leader who takes matters into his own hands. And especially considering that he had a Midianite wife and father-in-law and an Egyptian name.
He had a Cushite wife, too.
Yeah. And an Egyptian name that may indicate that the individual himself was Egyptian, probably named Ramos, born of Ra.
I don't think it's Ramoses. I don't think it's the Messis by literal there. I don't think it is. I think it's a different etymology. Okay. We can find a class of names in Egyptian that's called an Emshe name, which is like you would have, say, instead of Ra Moses, you would have Ra Emshe, basically Ra of the lake. And that's a much better etymology because Moses is not, in Hebrew, it's not Moses, it's Moshe. So an Emshe name makes a lot more sense etymologically than Messis.
One idea is that they took the Egyptian name and then made it into a Hebrew name to give it meaning, like to erase erase Ra's name from his.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think even if you have, say, the Messis etymology, you're still going to be most likely cutting off the theophoric element. Whether that theophoric element was Amun, Montu, doesn't matter. They're all equally detestable.
Yeah, I definitely do think it is interesting to look up the Moses in terms of his historicity. Yeah. So
now, a common argument is that he was that the river story came from a Sargon of Akkad, even though that the story is dates to the Neo-Assyrian period and drifted.
Well, the two stories have nothing. The only commonality between the two stories is the baby in the basket. That's it.
That wasn't uncommon in the ancient world.
That was not uncommon in the ancient world. No. Yeah. I mean, we compare the two stories. Moses' mother was a happily married woman. Okay, as far as we can tell.
Yeah.
Sargon's mother was a Neditum who violated a sexual vow to a god. That's what she did. Moses' mother tried to hide the baby for 3 months and couldn't anymore, so she put him in the basket because she knew he would be discovered and wanted to preserve his life. Sargon's mother wanted to be rid of the child and just didn't have the stones to kill her himself. Okay? And basically, Sargon's mother goes, well, it's in the god's hands now. Float it down. It's a very different motivation.
That's what mothers did with unwanted babies all the time back then.
Yes.
And then there's also this other concocted connection with Homer.
And then there's the gardener in Sargon of Akkad. The gardener finds the basket. In the Moses narrative, the daughter would be the daughter of the future king found it. Now, one of the interesting dynamics about this is that women in Egypt could adopt a child on their own initiative without anyone's permission at all. This was a right of being a woman in Egypt. The only exception to this is if they happen to be the daughter of a king. But what happens in the time of Moses is that he was part of what's called the Ramesside clan. Basically, the family that would become the Ramses and the Setis, the great kings. But at the time when he was adopted, the daughter, her father or grandfather, wasn't in line for the throne. It was another king that was on the throne that was unrelated, such as Horemheb.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? And it's only with the death of Horemheb that the Ramesside clan ascends to the throne.
Horemheb was the commoner that took the throne after he got rid of King Tut's family and erased Akhenaten's.
Well, okay, the way it works was King Tut died. He was the last of the Theban princes. Mm-hmm. Okay, there was no more Theban princes. No other Theban princes were eligible for the throne. He was the end of the Theban dynasty. The widow of King Tut, Ankh-Sunamun, tried to get the Hittite prince to assume the throne of Egypt. The Vizier Ai sends Horemheb out to knock off that prince. And while Horemheb is out on campaign, Ai takes the throne. He's on the throne for 4 years, and then the throne passes to Horemheb. And then Horemheb has a long reign between 15 to 21 years, depending on who you ask. And then Ramses I takes the throne. And so you have this succession crisis. This line of kings that have no successor. So Semenkhare, before King Tut, didn't have a successor, which is how Tut got the throne. Tut didn't have a successor. So that's why I took the throne. Ai's son, while alive at the time of his coronation, didn't survive the 4 years either. So he had no successor. Horemheb had no children. So you had this line of instability in the midst of a civil war with the Hittites.
Yeah, that's not good.
Or sorry, not a civil war, but a war with the Hittites.
Yeah.
So you had this massive instability. So Horemheb said to himself, "Okay, we're gonna solve the succession thing once for all." So he appoints his good friend Ramses, General Ramses, to take over after him. General Ramses was a grandfather with a big family. instant dynasty.
Mm.
And it is presumably the daughter of either Ramses I or Seti I that adopts Moses.
All right.
And that's
Now back to
before.
Yeah, I've heard this before, but I wanted to get your take on it. I mean, was there any truth to the sort of claim that Egyptian pharaohs tended to be more sort of unhealthy in terms of being weighing more, and being more likely to be obese due to their rich, lavish lifestyles?
No, there's actually no truth to that. In fact, one of the things is that the crown prince typically, while they were sort of princes, they ate like everyone else, like the nobility. In fact, what we find is that even the nobility, of the mummies we have examined, we have to understand that mummies are basically preserved corpses of the nobility of Egypt. Your typical commoner wasn't mummified. It was only the nobility who could afford the mummification process. Among those, about 30% of the nobility show periods of chronic malnutrition.
Mm-hmm.
So even the nobility had this, even though they sort of got the best, had times when they starved.
Mm-hmm.
So what we see in, say, the mummies of the kings is most of them are usually pretty trim and pretty fit. And that's because one's dietary habits are pretty well established by the time you become an adult. And you generally don't stray from your nutritional habits once you become an adult, because they're habits. They're ingrained. We find one exception to this, where we find one pharaoh who was exceptionally obese, at least according to Egyptian standards. And that was Queen Hatshepsut.
Oh.
She comes in, her mummy indicates that she was at least 250 pounds at the time of her death.
Yeah, I always like to find it funny. It's like, well, you're an obese Egyptian back then would be pretty much a modern American today in terms of weight.
It is true. We also have to understand too, though, that in many respects too, that obesity in Egypt was a sign of beauty. It wasn't a sign of unhealth. It was a sign that you were affluent, that you had, because there were actually people in Nubia who were on, say, a oats and milk diet, who were incredibly obese. And that was seen as a sign of great beauty. And that was the Egyptians commenting on the beauty.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so
I guess,
see, for example, I'm sorry?
I guess it kind of makes sense when you consider that if someone was big and someone was obese back then, well, that meant, well, wait, this guy knows where the food is at.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that would be sort of why it would be more associated with beauty and wealth, because, if you come from an area where people are starving, if you know someone that's obese, that's a good sign that guy knows where the food is at.
Now, it's interesting, though, that even though, say, a commoner or a regular noble person, if they were obese, that would be portrayed. That would be portrayed on stela and as a positive thing. We don't see that, though, with the portrayal of kings. But that's one of the reasons why it was more important for a king to be portrayed as a good soldier.
They always have him painted in propaganda poster, as we would call it then, painted on the walls of them in chariots and shooting bow and arrows at the enemy.
Yeah, I don't like the term propaganda because it's a bit anachronistic.
Yeah.
There are religious conventions here that demand that the king show himself to be physically fit enough to defend the assets of Egypt.
Yeah, like Tutmosis III, he's been in battle since he was a kid.
Oh yeah. I mean, and he kept going to battle. He never stopped.
Yeah, because the the court hated him.
The court hated him. He hated the court. Oh, he hated the court.
Oh, so at least it was a mutual hatred.
Oh, it was a mutual hatred. Oh yeah, they hated each other.
Then he went on to his legacy is that he's the Napoleon of ancient Egypt.
Yes, he is.
Mhm.
But he loved the battlefield. He absolutely loved going on campaign. It was no place he'd rather be than on campaign.
And his stepmother Hatshepsut. Why was it that? And I remember we're going out in the weeds here, but just on this one topic, why did he try to get rid of her name? Was there a sort of falling out within the family, or?
Well, she had usurped the throne. It was never hers by right. Okay.
Hmm.
She was a the regent. Okay. Now when Tutmosis III was declared king, he was like 2. He was an infant.
Hmm.
She was made regent to make decisions on his behalf. But then she decided she should wear all the funny hats.
Yeah.
And she basically usurped the throne. And then sort of sent him away to military school.
I partially bring this up is because early daters like to paint her as Bithia because it makes sense that he would want to get rid of her for bringing Moses into their lives.
That's not. I don't think that works. There's no evidence for that. I think that it's much more likely that she just took away what was rightfully his, and he was getting annoyed at it.
Anyway, back to Moses. There's also the concocted connection between him and Hammurabi with the law codes. Mind going into that?
Okay. Hammurabi dates to about 1725-ish.
Yeah.
Okay. So the concoction between Hammurabi and the law codes, we do find some connections between Mesopotamian law codes and, say, the biblical text.
Yeah.
We do find several of those law codes, say, quoted in Genesis with Abraham. In fact, most of Abraham's dealings are based upon those law codes. So we do find those echoes there.
Yeah, like they try to do with him, like they do with Sargon of Akkad, try to say that Moses is based on him and Hammurabi.
Yeah. Now you're not going to find anything like the 10 Commandments in the law codes of Mesopotamia. You just won't find it there. You will find, say, some of the echoes of, say, the miscellaneous laws. You'll also find cultural reactions to Egyptian culture in the law codes as well. Like, for example, the prohibition to eat pork. It was something that the Egyptians did. The Egyptians didn't eat pork. The Egyptians thought that the pig was a filthy animal. And somehow the Israelites picked that up too.
Along with circumcision.
Along with circumcision, yeah. Yeah, we actually find that at a mastaba near the pyramid of King Teti. It's actually portrayed.
I do remember seeing some artwork on that. It is actually interesting how that does work.
Anyway, anyway for the law codes. It's not uncommon for these kings delivering law codes. They got them from the certain deities from mountaintops. So that's sort of all over the place.
Well, here's sort of the thing about that. Just because there's cultural influence doesn't mean it's mutually exclusive to any purported utterance of a deity. Okay? And frankly, even most say even Bible-believing Christians will believe that to some extent. Like, for example, you talk about promiscuity in Egypt. Promiscuity in Egypt was absolutely everywhere. It was a very promiscuous society. So when Moses is told on Mount Sinai, thou shalt not commit adultery. Nobody has a problem saying that, Egypt had this problem. The Israelites had gotten this problem from Egypt. Therefore, in reaction to that culture, then God said, don't do this. Okay, well, then what about the opposite where, Egypt has something like don't eat pork. And then the Israelites are told don't eat pork because it'll set them apart from the culture in Canaan.
Yeah.
The fact is that, okay, does that all at all make it mutually exclusive, the cultural context plus God telling them to do something? Well, of course not. The two are not actually mutually exclusive.
Okay, Ramesses II, one of the most famous pharaohs in history besides King Tut and Cleopatra, is the pharaoh of the Exodus, right?
Mm-hmm.
According to the late date of the Exodus, one of the late dates, also the Ten Commandments, Prince of Egypt, various documentaries, history books, archaeologists like Eric Klein, and according to you and most Egyptologists who bothered to investigate the circumstantial evidence for the Exodus,
Yep.
the copper-skinned redhead great ancestor with dozens of wives, hundreds of kids, and whose name is plastered on more monuments than any other,
Yep.
humbled by a banished prince who returned as a shepherd. What do you suspect happened following the Red Sea or Sea of Reeds incident, and how do you think he managed to erase that memory from the public mind to where it had a bigger effect than Akhenaten's Damnatio Memori?
Well, first of all, in the case of the Damnatio Memori, he was wiping out already existing monuments that were all over Egypt. Okay. So we have a lot of good evidence for the Damnatio Memori for Akhenaten because because there's all that pre-existing material for him to erase.
Right.
It's a lot easier to prevent something from being written than to go back and erase it after. So we have to also understand that what we have too is a preservation issue. Okay. Most of the text we have are religious texts from Egypt anyway. Okay. 90% of all the texts we have, or more than that, 95, 99% of all the texts we have in Egypt are religious texts. Even those that have biographies on them are written for religious purposes. They're written as offerings to a various deity, either Osiris or Re or somebody. Okay? So you don't want bad news going up to the deity because these are offerings. The acts that you do in your life are an offering that you give to the god in the afterlife. And by putting it down on a religious stela or a temple, you're basically saying, we are reenacting this event over and over for the glory of your god. Now, do you want to put a military defeat in that?
Nah.
No.
I mean, yeah,
Nah.
I mean, I believe the only time that they ever recorded a military defeat is if it was followed up with them winning the war ultimately.
Yes, and that's the exception, is that if they had a near defeat, not a defeat, but a near defeat, that they could spin to a victory. Then they could say, I fought like Montu. Amun-Re was there, and by my hand, I single-handedly smote all those Hittites while the rest of my army was useless.
Yeah, and during the Battle of Kadesh, Ramesses
Mhm.
actually declared that he won the battle, even though it was
Yes,
a lie.
yes. All his other guys were incompetent, but it was him single-handedly fighting like Montu. But that sort of illustrates what sort of texts you find. Is they are religious texts. They are offerings. And they're meant to be offerings. You do not find unvarnished history on the walls of temples. It doesn't happen. It's always with that religious spin. Where you do find unvarnished history is on, say, papyrus or day rolls. Okay? The problem is that these are written on very ephemeral materials that did not survive the archaeological record. We only have one or two examples of fragments of day rolls from Deir el-Medina, where it's very dry, there's very little rain, and there's very little chance of it actually rotting away. The problem with the Exodus is the capital was located at Paramses, which is at the site of the modern city of Kontir. It's very wet there. No texts there have survived so far that we've discovered.
It is, yeah. I mean, that sort of does make sense because of how the weather conditions would be, and that would probably disintegrate any writings that were there.
Well, it also disintegrates not just papyrus, but also stone. People don't realize this because the salt content of the water at around that area is so high, and the stone becomes saturated with the water. As soon as you pull the stone out of the ground, the water evaporates, the salt crystals start expanding, and the within months that stone literally disintegrates before your eyes.
That actually does make a little bit of sense. Yeah. Um,
It sucks because there's less
I know it.
text.
I mean, I imagine many historians would love if that wasn't the case.
Oh yeah, I would
Mhm.
love if the scriptoriums that they found at say Avaris were intact. I mean, that would have been fantastic. But all we find at say the scriptorium at Avaris is a whole bunch of seals, like bullae, and a very very small fragment of a cuneiform text that dates to the first dynasty of Babylon. That's all we find at that scriptorium. There were hundreds of documents there. They found hundreds of bullae seals. None of them survived. None of the documents associated with the seals survived.
All right, depending on what time you have left, lay out the best evidence for the Exodus, why many Egyptologists aren't aware of them, and do you plan on doing peer-reviewed work on the topic anytime soon in the near future?
Well, I already have done peer-reviewed work on the subject, but there's always room for more peer-reviewed stuff. I am doing a peer-reviewed article on the so-called Berlin pedestal that supposedly has Israel on it and really doesn't. That was proposed by Peter van der Veen and Manfred Gorg. So I'm working on a peer-reviewed article for that. Now, the best, say, arguments for the Exodus comes down to basically three pieces of evidence. Okay. First of all is the actual abandonment of the city of Avaris. And the city of Avaris has an unbroken Semitic culture from essentially the beginning of Dynasty 18 all the way to the early to mid Ramesside period. Now, the Ramesside period is mostly made up of one king, which is Ramses II. So it falls like in the first 20, 25 years of his reign. And that's when we find the abandonment of Avaris. Okay? So that's the first piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence is the Merneptah Stela. The Merneptah Stela basically says that Ramses II's successor, Merneptah, in his 5th regnal year, encountered the Israelites on his campaign into Palestine. Okay, so by the time of the 5th regnal year, the Israelites already have a presence in Palestine. Now, the political situation depicted on the Merneptah Stele is very interesting too, because Merneptah has to engage, say, the Philistine cities like Gaza and Ashkelon, but he's also encountering Hurrians in northern Israel. So what we're seeing here is a bit of a snapshot of a time when the Israelites just established themselves in Canaan, but have not yet completed their conquest. Another great piece of evidence is actually the conquest of Jericho. Now, in 2020, a scholar by the name of Lorenzo Nigro basically found evidence of Bronze Age fortifications that were destroyed at Jericho. Now, the date of this destruction is roughly around 1210 BCE. This matches with the late Bronze destruction layer we find at Hatzor. Now, what's so interesting about this is both Hatzor and Jericho were claimed to have been destroyed by Joshua. So, destruction layers from the two sites have to at some point match if we are to believe a credible Joshua narrative.
Well, scholars like to say that that the conquest never happened. That was sort of
Well, as I said,
well,
2020.
yeah,
Things change. Scholarship
yeah,
changes with the
yeah,
turn of the shovel.
that it was a compressed narrative that that was a sort of another alternate version of the Judges, which is an expansive line of events of what happened.
Well, they are, the Judges and Joshua are written in as parallel histories. They're both written in the same way. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the events are any less historical. It just means it's being retold in a different way.
Just that they both have different versions of what really happened.
Well, they're not different versions because one takes off from where the other one leaves off. They're just sort of recounted in a pedagogical way. Okay, so they're different. It's different content told in a very similar fashion.
Right.
Pedagogical fashion.
For example, with Hathor, with Joshua, and then Deborah later attacked it.
Mm-hmm. But as far as sort of the dating of, say, Hathor, we have very pristine stratigraphy there. You have a destruction layer in early bronze. And not another destruction layer. You have continuous occupation until the late Bronze Age. In the case of Jericho, we don't only have the destruction of, say, the fortifications. We also have the fact that a scarab of Amenhotep III was found in one of the tombs. Plus, we also have the destruction layer that was discovered by Kenyon. So it's the only place where the two sort of cities match at the same relative time frame. So this book ends, say, the limit to which the Israelites could have wandered in the wilderness. And so we have the Merneptah Stela. We've got the destruction of Jericho on say the far end, but on, say, the other hand, we have, say, the abandonment of Avaris, and then we also have the death of the firstborn of Ramses II. Now, one of the things about the death of the firstborn of Ramses II is that he didn't actually, like, unlike a lot of kings who had lost their children in while they were still young, Ramses II's firstborn lived to adulthood and was crowned prince of Egypt until the 25th regnal year of Ramses II. Mm-hmm. He was the chief diplomat and crown prince, and he was also a father himself. He was already married and had children.
And it doesn't say the firstborn children. People automatically assume that they were all kids or babies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily, here's the thing about the firstborn. It's not necessarily a child, and it is not necessarily the firstborn is in time of frame. For example, if your firstborn child dies, your second son becomes the new firstborn. And that's because infant mortality was so high in Egypt. Firstborn is a designated title. It's not necessarily talking about an ordinality of birth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that firstborn, the firstborn in that context, they were tend to be given a lot more responsibilities than the other lineups. So I think it does make sense, because when you get rid of the firstborns, you're essentially creating a sort of power vacuum or a responsibility vacuum.
Well, in the case of Ramses II, it was not just that you created a responsibility vacuum, and that's a very important point right there, because what the death of the firstborn did was it cut off the next generation of leadership. And we have basically during roughly the 25th regnal year, we're not exactly sure the exact year, but we have both the loss of Amenhotep, Ramses II's firstborn, who was not only the crown prince, but he was the chief diplomat of Egypt. He was the man who negotiated the Hittite treaty that brought to an end that 50-year war. He was a stabilizing force in Egypt. He was sort of, say, the counterpart to Ramses II's impetuousness. Amenhotep was stable, diplomatic, well liked, and during the same time too, Egypt also loses one of its viziers, which is the equivalent of your prime minister. So the whole political infrastructure of Egypt was thrown into turmoil over this. Chaos.
What I like about Egypt in general is that in some ways it's a lot more unique than other cultures have been, in the fact that, because they did mummification and the like, they had a lot more medical knowledge than many other people around them, because they were working literally with corpses, and and there was a big taboo in many cultures about working with the dead.
Yeah.
So the fact they did that helped out.
We do find some very, very interesting details in, say, the biblical narratives that have only recently been confirmed in the archaeology about, say, mummification. Like, for example, the whole 40 days as a mummification process. That whole burying the body in natron, that's where it talks about, in the Bible, it talks about, say, the mummification of Jacob, where the process takes 40 days and then the Egyptians mourn for 70. And this has been recently confirmed in the archaeology, that the actual burial in the natron, where the mummy is actually desiccated, was a 40-day process. And after that, there was, say, a litany of where the body was observed and then wrapped and covered in spices and pitch, and then finally done the final wrap done and then buried on the 70th day.
I remember there was sometimes I have heard about where there was a bit of a botch in the sort of when they were going through the mummification, because like you said, that they would put the spices and all the liquids in there, and sometimes they would really overdo it, and you would end up, years later, we have to sort of scrape these mummies out because the liquid has sort of froze them in place.
Well, in some cases, that's intentional. In other cases, it isn't. Like, for example, for the mummification of King Tut, the inner sarcophagus was covered in this brown black concoction of pitch and plaster. And the whole sarcophagus was essentially covered in this, kind of like a cement to prevent its removal. We find this in a few other burials as well. Like, for example, we find this at a burial at the necropolis of Sinwasret III in Abydos, where one of the tombs was actually, one of the mummies was actually, buried in the sarcophagus, and then plaster was poured in. So the mummy was encased in this concrete.
Yeah, I always found that sort of thing interesting.
Going back to the early date, there's also the middle date, which is not even an option proposed by Freud.
No. Nobody goes with the middle option anymore. There's just no evidence for it. It's a dead proposal.
But early daters also like to say that's an explanation for why Akhenaten found the one god, because of the one god acting through the Exodus earlier. But explain how that doesn't work.
Well, for one thing, Akhenaten wasn't a monotheist. He was a pantheist.
Really?
Yes. When you look at the Amarna texts, it talks about all is Aten. Aten gives all creation life. Everything is part of Aten. Aten breathes life into all beings. Nothing is before the Aten. Nothing is after the Aten. Everything is part of the Aten. All the gods are Aten. Everything is Aten. He's a pantheist. He's not a monotheist.
Usually, because the common idea is that he worshipped the one god but viewed him as the sun.
Well, The Akhenaten viewed himself as the highest manifestation of the Aten.
Mm.
Okay.
So you could say he's a very humble man.
Oh, very humble. But every king
Also has something to do with his father, the magnificent Amenhotep III.
Well, Amenhotep III had already introduced Aten worship. And we actually find that going back to Tutmosis IV.
Oh,
He also had some Aten worship going on. So Aten worship didn't develop out of a vacuum.
Mm.
It was part of a solar tradition that had been included among the royal cults.
so how did they come to be viewed as the one god,
Well,
or the one god was seen through that lens?
that's a very, very interesting question. And we don't exactly know how it transformed from being one cult of many to being a exclusive cult. That's still sort of an open question in Amarna studies. We do know that it probably originated with Akhenaten himself. I think part of it was the fact that Akhenaten was always at loggerheads with the Theban priesthood. One of the things we have to understand is Akhenaten actually was crowned Amenhotep IV.
Right.
And he starts to build at Karnak, and he starts building some temples, and part of those walls are still there, actually. But he was sort of doing kind of what his father did. Now, Amenhotep III did a lot of religious reforms at Karnak, Luxor. The way Amenhotep III did his reforms, though, was he would reduce the pantheon of gods, but give lots of money in exchange. So in a sense, Amenhotep III sort of smoothed ruffled feathers by buying off the priesthood. On the other hand, his son, Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten, just did the reforms. He just thought, as high priest of all of Egypt, which the king technically was, that it was his prerogative to make whatever religious reforms he wanted.
And eventually the priests of Ra and Amun wanted him dead.
Well, what happened was that the priests of Amun-Re, did basically the passive aggressive thing. They had put up roadblocks, not listen to orders. They would put up this passive interference and just try to interfere with all his plans. And essentially what happened was Akhenaten had enough. And in his 6th regnal year, he relocated his capital to Amarna, where he built his holy city. And at that point, what he did was the king still had control of all the endowed lands to Karnak Temple and all the other temples of Egypt. And basically what he did was he cut off all the royal endowments. Without those royal endowments, all the temples had to close because they couldn't feed the priests.
And that never ended well.
Well, I don't think it ended as badly as everyone says it does. One of the things is the evidence that Akhenaten's reign ended in revolt is exceptionally thin. The evidence, there's no evidence. In fact, we have evidence that says that there was a orderly transition in power.
His son took over for one of his sons. Forgot his name.
Smenkhare.
Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, he reigned for 1 or 2 years, and then King Tut ruled at Amarna for another 3 years. So we have at least 2 successors at Amarna. There might have been more. We're not sure, but we have 2 successors at Amarna. You can't have that unless there's an orderly transition of power. And frankly, Akhenaten's military was very strong. It was exceptionally strong. There was if anyone had decided to do an insurrection, Akhenaten could have put it down just like that. He had a very strong. The Amarna military was actually very much stronger than people believe.
But he chose not to do much with it.
Well, here's the thing. On the first few years of his reign, he went on campaign. We actually have evidence of Akhenaten going on campaign into the Levant.
Mm.
He did what every king of Egypt does, which is he goes on campaign for the first couple years. And then what happened is he got more interested in his little pet religious project.
Mm.
That this in no way diminished the military. It just, the military now had time on their hands.
Mhm.
They could build up more forces. They could enhance military still got lots of money. None of the endowment was cut off to the military. If anything, the endowment from the temples was moved into the military. It was a party time for the military.
Yeah, so, I guess they got a little vacation for a bit.
Pork barreling.
Okay, so going over the history of the Israelites, and before we go into that, what's your opinion on the Levite hypothesis that they were just the Levites were enslaved and they moved out of Egypt led by Moses and lived in Midian for a time where they became acquainted with Yahweh and then introduced his worship to the Holy Land when they went there following the collapse of the Bronze Age, and figured that Yahweh and El were two versions of the one Almighty God, and it went from there. And the Levites became assimilated into the tribes of Israel and became their guardians and priests ever since.
Well, if you ever hear Friedman talk about his hypothesis in a paper, about 80% of his discussion is talking about the documentary hypothesis. And then he gets to the Levite hypothesis. Okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If you didn't have the documentary hypothesis or biblical minimalism, you wouldn't need the theory at all. It's really just a theory to support the idea of an actual exodus while maintaining the theoretical constraints of the documentary hypothesis. As an Egyptologist, I don't have to buy the documentary hypothesis. I can just go on the historical evidence. So for me, it's just a theory without a proper basis for actually holding it. Because here's the thing, the documentary hypothesis proposes a very, very late date for the Torah documents. And yet what I see from the historical evidence is some of those documents are exceptionally early. I mean, late Bronze Age kind of early. So if we got late Bronze Age documents here, even if they're edited together, then the necessity for a documentary hypothesis is almost non-existent. You don't need a documentary hypothesis if you've got late Bronze Age documents. Mm-hmm. So if you have late Bronze Age documents and you don't have a documentary hypothesis, what's the use of a Levite Exodus theory? It's really a justification for the documentary hypothesis.
And an explanation for why the Israelites Israel isn't mentioned in the Song of the Sea and then in the Song of Deborah.
Yeah, there's other he does, but then again he's going down that sort of textual tradition of orality, finally by writing, finally by redacting, finally by final redaction in Babylon.
All right, which so since the JEDP theory you don't go with, do you also go with the fragmentary hypothesis or supplementary hypothesis, or?
You would have to explain those hypotheses because they're not part of, say, historians of an Egyptological bent.
Right, which is different oral traditions and documents got compiled over time and it became part of the text.
Yeah, I think what we have is, say, by the early kingdom period, by the reign of King Saul, maybe King David at most, is you have the sources, actual written documented sources that are then sort of compiled together and edited. And what I mean by edited here is just transitioned. I think most of those original sources have been preserved.
Well, I mean, we all do know that the tour riders were a bunch of Bronze Age goat herders.
Well, they also had various classes too. I mean, class distinction is nothing new in the ancient world. Very few people could read or write, but some people could. And we even have evidence of scribal schools in Canaan. So, like at Tel Araj. So there was literacy in Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's the minority. But it's the minority in all populations, at least until Roman times, when it sort of hit the peak of the ancient world. But there was literacy in ancient Israel. There was literacy everywhere, but just it was a minority.
Okay, going through all the time Israelites were in Egypt, how many years would you say they were in Egypt because of the symbolic nature of the numbers and the mixed match with them and Canaan? And
I would say they were there for less than 350 years.
Because one argument that scholars make is that the Israelites weren't there is because Egyptian would have been part of their language, because they were in Babylon for 70 years in exile, and they were speaking Aramaic up until Jesus' time.
We do find Egyptian loanwords in the Torah documents. We find a lot of them. So they did incorporate some of the Egyptian language into their language. We find Egyptian names in the Torah documents.
Another part of the Levite hypothesis is that all the Levites had Egyptian names.
Well, a lot of them did, yes. But we also find others as well. So, that's it's not something that's exclusive to the Levites. We do find it with other people as well. But it is true that the Levites did have a preponderance of Egyptian names. Now, some of that might have been because the Levites were also, say, leaders in their local communities, particularly at, say, what we would call the Temple of Baal. There was one particular temple in Avaris that was, let's say, run by Asiatics. Okay, and we find this at Avaris, and it's a particular temple and district that had a high concentration of Asiatics, and the temple itself was run by Asiatics, and it was dedicated to the storm god Baal. So we do find, like, for example, the Korah revolt. The Korah revolt is basically in the Torah is basically around Levites who had been priests in Egypt, and now suddenly they're finding themselves out in the cold. So it makes sense that a lot of Levites would have these sort of Egyptianized names because they were basically leaders of a certain cult within Egypt.
I remember with Baal, like, I believe that Baal was two different words, like the Baal and the all.
No, like, it's just Baal. It means Lord. It's a common Semitic word. Cool. You find that in Semitic going all the way to Proto-Semitic.
And the Hyksos, the Asiatics associated him with a Seth.
Yeah, basically the Hyksos, and basically the Egyptians too. The Egyptians too associated Baal with Seth because they're both storm gods. They're both gods of unbridled power. And even the kings of early Dynasty 19, a lot of them have close associations with Seth. It's very interesting because when we see, say, the Ramesside kings come to power, before they become kings, they're governors around that area of Avaris. So long before they ever became king and established their capital at Paramses, they were long before then governors at Avaris. That was the land that they earned, their ancestral land that they earned from the original conquest by Moses I. So they're steep. The Ramesside dynasty is already steeped in a lot of that Canaanite culture that they were around when they were governor of the regions.
We forgot to go over why the Israelites were oppressed by the Egyptians in the first place. It was because that the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, Moses I, feared that they would join their enemies and rise up again, the Hittites.
Well, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that the quote king of the oppression is actually a literary amalgamation of many kings.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just one king. It's many kings that has been sort of compressed into this literary amalgamation.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the deeds of many kings here being sort of put together as a literary figure.
So like an idealization.
It's an idealization. It's not just one king, it's many. A slavery of some of the residents of Avaris was established by Ahmose I. We find this in the biography of Ahmose, son of Abana, who was a general under Ahmose I. Yeah, Ahmose is a very common name in that period. It's exceptionally common. You even find women called this. So you have to be very specific which Ahmose you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It gets very confusing.
The one who drove out the Hyksos and
yes,
wanted to make sure that the Asiatics would never have power again.
yes. But the conquest is the sort of the main general is Ahmose, son of Abana. And he's a general under Ahmose I and Amenhotep I. And he is given slaves as a reward for conquering Avaris. So this is where we find, say, the beginning of slavery at Avaris.
Mm.
Now, after that, how they use the slaves becomes sort of the purview of other kings. And probably the king that was, say, that ruled at the time when Moses had to flee was probably, my guess, Horemheb. That would be my guess.
Repeat that?
My guess is that the king that ruled at the time when Moses was compelled to flee after he killed the Egyptian was Horemheb.
Oh, so not the first Ramesses or Seti the first?
Nope.
Mm-hmm.
We have to understand that Horemheb is a very different kind of king.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very, very different kind of king. He's a law and order kind of king. Mm-hmm. He actually drafts the first law in Egypt.
Mm.
Egypt had no laws.
How did their society function for all those centuries?
You can function a society in two ways: law or order.
Mm.
Egypt had order.
Mm. I remember that sort of goes into the purpose of law codes, where, there's a common conception for us where we read law codes in the same way we would read, like, let's say, our local state law codes. But I would say that that's sort of anachronistic in order to read ancient Near East law codes like we would read our own law codes today.
Yes, yeah, it's very different.
So Moses was a kid during the Akhenaten and King Tut's reign.
Probably yes.
Mm.
So that the idea of the one guy was planted the seeds were planted in his head, and then the one guy introduced.
We don't know exactly where Moses got the idea. We think that he picked up a lot of his ideas actually from Midian.
Yeah, like that's where the one God contacted him at.
Yeah.
But
it's also in that area. You also had, say, Shasu, who were also connected with Yahweh.
But the idea of the one God was introduced with Akhenaten's family, and he.
Well, again,
Akhenaten
worshipped a pantheism. He didn't worship one God.
Right. I mean,
there were many gods that Akhenaten actually attributed to the Aten. Mm-hmm. Early on, Re-Horakti was considered a manifestation of the Aten. You see, here's the thing: the damnatio memoriae policy of Akhenaten was very sort of sketchy. It wasn't a blanket thing against all gods, only certain gods, and some more than even others. Amun-Re was public enemy number one. Okay. Osiris a little less so. Hathor, not so much. Didn't touch Anubis in the slightest. So it the Demitio Memore was very, very sort of spotty in its coverage.
Okay, so how old would Moses have been when he confronted Ramesses II?
Well, here's the problem with that. There's a lot of problems. We don't know exactly how old Moses was. Now, what we are told is Moses left Egypt when he was 40. He spent 40 years in Midian and then came back to Egypt.
Yeah, but that's sort of the usual 40 to designate a long period of time.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So we don't know.
I mean,
that's the issue with the whole 40 thing it is a euphemism for an unspecified length of time.
Which is also another hermeneutic, along with the Red Sea or Sea of Reeds parting, what they did with the Egyptian water magic trick.
Yes.
And I believe also Moses died at 120, I think.
Because it's 40 in the wilderness too. So what they did at 120 was just multiplied 40 times 3.
Yeah. I always did find that interesting. I always thought that was also sort of how their take on the Egyptian ideal age as well, where they had, so they said Moses lived past the Egyptian ideal.
A greater man than Joseph.
Yes. Yes, there is probably some communication of that there. But we can't be sure because 40 is again such an imprecise thing. It could be long, it could be short. I mean, we know on the Moabite stela, King Omri was ascribed 40 years on the throne when he only reigned 12. So you're not even talking an approximately 40 there. You're just talking really an indeterminate 40. So we find this sort of spotty usage all over. This is you can't trust anything that sort of says 40 as a literal count.
Yeah. What I always did find interesting when it comes to the conquest narrative is how it does have some language that we do find in other cultures, like you had brought up before about how you'd have a king that would say, "Oh, they smote all the members of this tribe" or something. And later on you'd say, "Well, wait, the tribe's still there."
Yeah, the so-called genocide that's they like to claim. Anachronistic term like that.
A lot of those was really sort of driving out. A lot of that was not so much that there was a genocide, but there was a lot of that was just driving them out of the land.
Now go kill every man, woman, and child, and do not spare even the donkeys or the livestock or the cattle or any of that.
Yeah. Of course, what did the Israelites actually do? They took the cattle for themselves and then got punished for it.
And keep
because they were disobedient.
Keep the virgins for yourselves. Yeah, I mean, I would think that even back then, to hear the term, the phrasing of, kill the women and children as well would have been probably as harsh on them too as well, because there was sort of an honor code.
Okay, we're talking a little bit too about, say, tribal politics and clan politics as well. And we have to realize that clan politics, it can be very, very harsh. It's very, very harsh.
That's true.
Like, for example, and we see this among the Bedouin today, if a person from one clan rapes a woman in another clan, the appropriate response is to wipe out the entire clan.
Mm.
That's the appropriate response in clan politics. Because what happens is if you show that one individual can get away with that, even if they kill that one individual, it opens the door to it repeating again, and it threatens the safety of the clan.
Mhm.
So we have to view, say, a lot of what's happening in, say, the conquest in terms of clan politics.
Mhm.
They have to be very, very harsh. Because there was times when they had considered not being harsh, and it came back to bite them hard.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember it would have seemed harsh even back then because there was sort of an honor culture that went around with harming the women and children because
Yeah.
there wasn't really seen as honor in doing that.
Yeah. There were limits, and they were limits that they did say respect. But again, it all boils down to what was the implications within that sort of society of clan politics.
That's true too. Yeah.
Also, since you're an expert in this, obviously an expert in this time period, uh, would you mind clarifying how slavery was dealt in Egypt and then in Israelite culture?
Okay.
Because there's
Well,
misconceptions around both.
Well, in the case of Egypt, slavery was done in one of two ways. Slaves were either taken by conquest, and that's where you get sort of mass groups of slaves coming into Egypt, or it was somebody could be sold into slavery. They could sell themselves or have a family member sell them into slavery.
Mhm.
Okay? Now, slavery in Egypt was a very different proposition than you'd find in the rest of the ancient Near East. The slavery in Egypt was not the lowest rank in social status. It was second lowest. Okay? It was actually one step above being a farmer.
Mm.
And that's because slaves in Egypt generally had highly valued skills that the Egyptians could use. Think of them kind of like IT workers.
Yeah.
Okay? You know, they have no respect, but they have skills that everyone needs.
Mm-hmm.
So slaves were expensive. Farmers weren't. Farmers, they had more farmers than they knew what to do with.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't put a slave to work in the fields. You had them like making bricks. And the reason why they made bricks is because they could do it more efficiently than the Egyptians. They could be vintners. They could be coppersmiths. They could be fig knockers. They could be stone cutters. Stone cutters in the sense of, say, gemstones, not temples. They could have be, say, the equivalent of accountants, so or overseers of your household. So they could do all these sort of, say, high level jobs that they didn't have to essentially pay for.
Mm-hmm.
So they made life better for the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
because obviously in a Western context, when we
Mhm.
hear the word slavery, it obviously goes back to our own modern history of
Mhm.
our dealing with slavery.
yeah.
So,
Now, slavery in Egypt was for life unless you were adopted by an Egyptian free person who then gave you a writ of freedom.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, and
Also, in the case of the Israelites, when they were out in the wilderness, they still preferred to. The reason why they preferred to go back to Egypt is because they were at least better fed there, and
Yeah.
you're accustomed to more beautiful scenery, and like, oh, I wish we were back in Egypt. Life was so much better there. Because
They do
that
pine for
doesn't mean they
Egypt.
weren't treated harshly, but
Yeah. Well, the thing is, one of the things about the Sinai experience too, we have to keep in mind is it's not the same as the Sinai experience today.
Mhm.
Okay. During the late Bronze Age, the Sinai was still savanna.
Mhm.
It still had almond and acacia trees. It still had grasslands. People from Midian did pastured their animals in Sinai.
hmm.
Mhm.
So water was still not bountiful there. Okay, but it was more hospitable then than it is today. Now, the northern Sinai had completely dried out. There was no question about that. It was not a nice place. But southern Sinai still had some verdancy to it.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember it was sort of funny because I always joke around with my friend. I said the Jewish people back then were so bad that even Moses told them to shut up.
What's the reason why we don't find traces of them in the Sinai again?
Well, there's many reasons why we wouldn't find it. First, they didn't hang around long.
Mhm.
I mean, the only reason we find Bedouin sites is they come back to the same site century after century. Say in the Bedouin sites, what we find at the local sites is remains of say knapping, which is the cutting of flint tools. So they come to the same sites over and over again where they find flint and stone and they make their stone tools there. Second of all is the fact that you don't have a lot of clay in Sinai. So the people aren't making pots, so they're not breaking pots. No broken pots. It's hard to find remains.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and
We
I also
do
know
find
the
that also in the Sinai, there were also a lot of, say, during the time of the Late Bronze Age, there was still wild game in Sinai. And in the case of the Israelites, they were eating quail. We don't know exactly what manna was, but it could
Probably
have been
that
fungus or something.
probably that white, sticky, sugary substance that insects
That's one
chew.
explanation. I find actually probably the more compelling explanation is it was a kind of fungus that
mushroom.
was, say, yeah, mushroom.
Like
Mushroom.
Bedouins use as sweetener today.
Yeah, there is that. That's a possibility. I find the mushroom thing more compelling because they would find this first thing in the morning
Mhm.
On, say, the dewy ground. Well, that's a perfect area for fungus to grow.
Mhm.
So I'm more compelled to think that it was say a fungus, but that again is neither here nor there. The fact is that they are going around and they're sort of collecting food as they go.
Mhm.
And back to what
They
I was
also still have their herds too.
I think that's common in nomadic tribes
Yeah,
where they would just keep food around while they're on the go.
yeah.
back to what I was going to ask you before about you being an expert in this. Also about the slavery and Israelite culture.
Yeah. It's different in Israelite culture because they did have two sort of classes of slaves in Israelite and non-Israelite slaves.
Mhm.
In the case of an Israelite slave, they could only keep them for 6 years and then had to release them on the seventh.
Mhm.
And in many respects, Israelite slavery was a way to discharge debt. It was an early form of bankruptcy.
Mhm.
Now, in the case of, say, women in slavery in Israel, it's a little different because a woman who was a slave was not released. And that's because of the sort of the whole, well, there's the possibility that there's some sexual relation might have gone on between slave and master, in which case the woman is now tainted goods in the community and is then destitute.
Well, that, and I also think that would be sort of about the idea that if they release the woman, then
Mhm.
who's going to really take care of her?
Take care of her,
once she
yeah.
leaves?
She's destitute.
Why would a
She's
loving God
destitute. She
allow
can't marry.
this?
There's that's a bad situation.
Like what?
So I mean, yes, and you wouldn't be surprised that some people they said, well, you have two options. You can either remain a slave, or we can just kick you out and you're destitute.
Yeah,
And yeah, so that would be a sucky situation to be
that
in.
would suck terribly.
Mhm.
Like why would a loving God allow this to happen?
Yeah, it's just funny. Yeah.
It's again, it's not that God approved of slavery, but
Mhm.
slavery was everywhere.
Mhm.
It was part of the culture. You
Yeah,
couldn't,
I remember
it's
that some scholars do argue, like I can't remember, I think his name is Walter Kaiser Jr. He
Mhm.
does argue, I believe, that like a lot of the not non-Egyptian, a lot of the non-Israelite slaves were war captives, where
some of them were. Yeah.
yeah, so we're basically, and this is actually, I believe this, you find this in Moses' account, in the conquest accounts, where they would go up to a city or something and they would say, hey, you either surrender to us or we're just going to go in there and wipe you out. and if they surrendered, they would just take them and they would become slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that, obviously that wasn't all of them. There was obviously other ones, but that is one area that the non-Israelite slaves came from.
It also depended on which sort of tribes of people that they were encountering.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah.
the Israelites did treat sort of Abrahamic peoples different than non-Abrahamic peoples. So there was sort of some differentiation there between who was a cousin and who was a foreigner.
That's true too. I remember that they were especially more hostile to the Canaanites.
Yes.
Well,
They were more hostile to the Canaanites. They were more hostile to the Hurrians. They were more hostile to the Hittites.
Well, they were
basically the non-indigenous people of the area.
Well, they were a Canaanite tribe until they went in Egypt.
Yeah. Well, they were Amorites.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were actually the Israelites are technically Amorites.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't actually Canaanites. They were actually Amorites. So they had come from Ur across the Fertile Crescent as sojourners. So they were actually Amorites.
Well, that contradicts what most scholars say about them.
Yes, well.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Abraham's even called, say, the son of an Amorite.
Right. Like, we're not talking about him, but their culture and their practices, that they're originally followers of El, and then they went to Egypt, and then when they came out of Egypt...
Well, they picked up all sorts of cultural customs along the way.
Mm-hmm. That's true, too.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the reasons why, say, Joseph fits so well in Avaris, is he's of Amorite ancestry coming to an Amorite city.
I remember, sometimes also what would happen with the way the non-Israelite slaves would come in is it would be sort of a trade program where they would go to like the foreign land. They say, "Oh, let's say you have your own slave. Well, we'll take them from you," or the slave would go to them. And that could be sometimes how it worked. So yeah, I always do find it interesting because I've been looking up commentaries and trying to find work on, because that's sort of my interest when it comes to many of the Bible is their relationship with slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my friend here, he loves the Egyptian side. He loves the Egyptian side and the Exodus side. I'm more of a fan of the Levitical side, like Leviticus and sort of that sort of culture and time frame of that area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but fun fact is that the late date of the Exodus and the early date of the Trojan War would happen around the same time.
Oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. It is around the same time, and it's when the major powers also start losing control too.
Right, but the later date of the Trojan War would seem to fit better because that's when the collapse of the Bronze Age happened, and the Sea People swept through Ugarit and all those other places.
Well, they're already making their incursions well before then.
Like that was just their opportunity to let loose.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the invasion of the Sea Peoples during the time of Ramses III, they're already established in Canaan at that point. I mean, a lot of scholars, the Philistines. A lot of scholars treat that as the beginning of the Sea Peoples and the Philistines. But we have to remember that they had already taken over cities in Canaan by that point, and were just moving into Egypt at that point.
I was about to say that's when the conquest would happen, but if the Exodus was decades earlier, then the conquest would follow after that.
Well, we got the conquest. We got the conquest happening around 1210, 1220-ish. Okay.
And the Bronze Age collapse would be 1180s.
Well, here's 1177 is the date that Klein gives. Now, one of the things is that collapse didn't. I mean, he uses here's what I hate about Klein's book. I hate this about Klein's book is he gives a one date, 1 year, and says this is the year. And in his book, he's more nuanced than that. But nobody takes the nuance.
Right. He said it was meant to be the 1184, but they changed the chronology again.
Yes.
Before it was published. Can't make up their minds.
The fact is that the conditions that led up to the collapse happened 100 years before and 100 years after. It's a period of time. It's not just 1 year.
Right, like the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which took centuries.
I mean, by the time of Ramses II, the Philistines had already established themselves in Canaan, and he was more or less powerless to stop it.
Yeah. So just so everyone, past the hour and a half mark, just so
Anyway, back to the Sea of Reeds. Anyway, what's that? The Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea? So there's no more confusion.
It's Sea of Reeds.
All right, and it was more of a. Was it more like a sandbar or a?
We don't know exactly what caused it to split. There's a lot of theories out there. I don't have an opinion on that.
Well,
I will say that it happened in what's called the Pelusiac Estuary. That's on the northwestern side of the Sinai.
all right, and that's when the. So, we know that Ramesses didn't drown.
We know Ramses didn't drown. We also know that almost none of the pharaohs did. There's no pharaoh drowned.
So just
as far as we know.
Just his army, and then he went back home humiliated and said not to forget this ever happened.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, I mean, as long as we all know that Behemoth is a dinosaur.
What?
Dinosaurs.
Well, I didn't catch that.
Let me see. I said as long as we remember that Behemoth is a dinosaur and a dinosaur
Leviathan. Yeah. Which also ties into that the parting of the Sea of Reeds also tied into that with the cosmic battle against the Leviathan Chaos Dragon.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Sort of all these different hermeneutics coming at once, sort of thing.
I think we should wrap up a bit.
All right.
So because it's past 12 here for me.
All right. So tell the audience all about yourself, your future. Your future projects, where to find you, all about where to find you, and your.
Well, I've got a YouTube channel, Ancient Egypt and the Bible, and we are trying to get support through Patreon to do more projects like the book I just published called The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context, an Illustrated Journey. So we are looking to do, say, more stuff on the Exodus, and that requires support.
All right, because once we find more conclusive evidence, then it'll be the most important archaeological discovery of all time.
Well, there's a lot of evidence already. We could just keep going on and on and on about the evidence.
Gotta make it mainstream.
Yep. Few people have heard of it. But it's out there.
Yep.
All right, so go follow Dr. Falk, and we'll see you next time. Getting jiggy with 'em.